Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Building Hope and Saving Lives in Our Churches. We'd like to start things off today with a video. It's actually a segment from our LivingWorks Faith program, and we think it really helps to illustrate the challenges that many ministry leaders face today when dealing with the issue of suicide.
I think about perhaps my first experience being invited to join a family after word that their son had ended his life, and I was really unnerved by that. The phone call came and they gave me a little bit of indication of what had happened and asked if I would come by, and honestly I was very nervous and didn't know what I should do, what I would say. I wasn't even sure that I would actually follow through and go. I certainly didn't know what to say. Felt a lot of pressure about things that I thought I needed to say, and so it produced for me a lot of anxiety.
Most clergy are afraid to say anything. My experience with young chaplains, young pastors is they sense there's something not right, but man, if I say suicide, am I going to offend them? You got to learn to address your own fear and talk about what you sense, your sense of discernment. Ask the question. I would much rather have offended somebody out of love and care than to attend their funeral. You don't want to be that pastor. You don't want to be that chaplain or member of the clergy that knew something was going on. You could have done something about it. You are a member of the clergy, and you have this sacred role of entering into people's lives at times of need. Ask in an appropriate way, hey, what's going on in your life? And can I help you find sources of help? And Pastor, I'm not asking you to solve all these problems. You don't have to. I'm just asking you, there's a vulnerable adult there, a vulnerable child. Don't leave them alone by not asking or following up on what you sense.
So there we go. We are getting some comments that sound may have been an issue. If you were not able to hear that video, please, just send us a message in the chat, and we're going to try perhaps to rerun that maybe a little bit later on. But we do want to jump in. And of course, that was just one example of what faith leaders face when it comes to the really difficult issue of suicide. As a pastor, Dave felt unprepared to provide counsel to that family who had just lost their son. And while his very presence was extremely valuable to that family, he knew that he needed to be able to offer more. So that's exactly where LivingWorks Faith comes in. And we're going to talk about our new program coming up just a little bit later. So my name is Michelle Skierman. I'm going to be the moderator for this webinar. We'd like to hear from you, our viewers today. We would love to know where you're tuning in from and what denomination you're with. So if you'd like to share that, please go ahead. We're really pleased to have three ministry leaders with us today. Of course, we're going to hear from LivingWorks Faith Program Director, Glenn Bloomstrom. Glenn is the driving force behind LivingWorks Faith. He's a retired U.S. chaplain colonel and an adjunct professor at Bethlehem Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Glenn is also a member of the Faith Communities Task Force of the National Action Alliance on Suicide Prevention. Then we're going to have a panel discussion with two leaders from Westwood Community Church in Chanhassen, Minnesota. I hope I said that right. They'll share with us their experience in introducing a network of safety into their church and the effect it's had on their community. Our panelists for today, really pleased to have with us Dave Troutman, the community care pastor at Westwood, and John Diddy, the kids ministry pastor, also at Westwood. We're going to have a Q&A session as part of our panel discussion. So please, as we go through, I know you're going to think of things you want to ask, so put them in the chat. We'll be sure to pass them along. Many of you attending today, you might not be familiar with LivingWorks, so we're going to start there. I'd like to ask Glenn. Glenn, can you give us an introduction of LivingWorks as an organization?
Certainly, Michelle, thank you. Well, humbly, gratefully, LivingWorks has been around for quite some time. And like the slide says, we are world leaders in suicide prevention training, especially intervention training. We've got trainers around the world who train crisis line workers, military, school, and many, many other segments of society. We've trained 2.5 million people since 1983, and our programs are designed for all audiences, but really what's very unique about LivingWorks Faith is we have many strong faith connections among our trainers as well as our team members at LivingWorks. So we're launching our first program specifically for Christian faith communities and ministry leaders.
So Glenn, we always want to get right to the why. Why is LivingWorks doing this? Why now? How big of an issue is suicide?
Well, we know that suicide has not gone down since we've started taking statistics. We have the highest rate since 1941, the highest suicide rate. And looking back even to 1999, we've seen a consistent upward tick in suicides. It's the second leading cause of death for youth between 15 and 24. And for every person that dies by suicide, 136 are impacted, and some very significantly. Also, focusing in on ministry leaders, we know that 2/3 have 5 hours about of training or less. That means that 1/3 have had no training. And many, many churches and people of faith struggle with the issue of stigma when it comes to suicide.
And so, what about the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, this is affecting all of us. We keep hearing, negative impacts on mental health. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Well, really, since the beginning of COVID, there have been many articles that have come out. And there was in the Journal of the American Medical Association in April 2020, Mark Rieger wrote an article that said COVID-19 was a perfect storm of risk for suicide. And so that same perfect storm of risk affects churches and communities. And he highlighted these 6 things, the loss of jobs, economic stress, much more anxiety, and those who are in vulnerable communities placed under much more pressure because of social isolation due to social distancing policies, online, school. We're living that. We're well into that. One of the things they identified was the barriers to mental health treatment, because prior to COVID-19, almost all mental health treatment was face-to-face. Then with indirect and direct connections to COVID, self-medication, people who are already struggling with depression, and we've even seen it unfold, people who were in care centers and nursing homes becoming much more vulnerable because of a lack of connection to their loved ones. And then finally, an increase in firearm sales during this whole period due to a variety of factors as well as COVID. But yet, Mark Rieger also identified some powerful opportunities for suicide prevention as he was speaking about suicide prevention. He stressed that physical distance does not need to mean social distance. And so, as we've walked through this, I think he's right. It has become an opportunity, and where would we be without platforms like Zoom? Also, he stressed that most likely distance-based and online suicide prevention would be probably a very, very key, I should say, life-giving or life-saving initiative. He said that telemedicine and telebehavioral health support would be key. And there was so much resistance to this prior to COVID-19. Now, all my friends that are therapists and such, 99% or 95% of their work is done online. And then finally, he said that the pulling together effect could be an opportunity, that we as a people would find ways to work around and to get through this. And certainly we're doing that. So these same opportunities exist in the church and in faith communities as well.
So speaking of pulling together, that's a nice segue into the network of safety. It's a concept that we at LivingWorks are quite familiar with, but some of the people on our webinar today might not understand it. So Glenn, would you explain what a network of safety is?
Sure. Let me just tie that, though, to the COVID-19 in the sense that safety involves sharing information regularly with empathy and optimism. So I think that's happening in our churches, online and gathering together, even while we social distance. And then showing who we are through our faith identity and the efficacy of our faith during times of suffering. That connectedness, even if it's on the phone or through a window, outside, or gathering together outside. It's giving voice, sharing stories of hope, and then calming by being transparent about our journey and where we are. And then all of that grounded in faith communities to an unchanging God. All of these elements are powerful prevention elements that undergird what we call a network of safety. So, as we think of a faith community network of safety from suicide, we believe that this involves people watching over and caring for each other with skills and with confidence to address mental health, crisis, change, unpredictability that all can sometimes contribute to suicide. So we have a variety of programs that are role-based and levels of training for different people in different settings or having different responsibilities. So LivingWorks Start is for anyone and everyone. It's a connecting program. And as I said before, having an online program during this time of COVID-19 has been just very, very important. But then our other two primary intervention trainings, LivingWorks Safe Talk and LivingWorks Assist, work together with LivingWorks Start, where we recognize someone is struggling and we make sure they receive help at that level of start training. We know how to connect them to someone who can help them with the Safe Talk training, and then there can be a full intervention with safety planning skills to support people during crisis. So these are all focused on intervention. But then our new program, LivingWorks Faith, puts it all together by talking about, as I mentioned a moment before, all of the good things that exist in churches and faith communities that are preventive, that are upstream, that are very powerful in keeping people safe, but also what to do when there's been suicide behaviors, an attempt or a death. That is where LivingWorks Faith comes in. And all together, they create a network of safety.
And so, Glenn, I'd love to see how this, could work or what it would look like, pardon me, in a faith community or church setting.
Of course. And we have a wonderful slide that just illustrates this so well. So, interested members, people who want to be better prepared to talk to someone when they sense suicide may be present, that would be our identification level start. I like to say that's kind of like CPR, the most basic first aid skills. Then natural helpers and volunteers who can bring and make that connection. That's kind of like basic first aid. And then, as we see here, 3 leaders in the front of this notional church, associate ministry leaders, and even the senior ministry leaders, all working together to establish a culture of hope, openness, and support to talk about and use the word suicide within the context of the church, and then to be able to understand all the good things they're doing to prevent suicide, how to help when suicide behaviors are present, and to know how to make a very good safety plan as people within the congregation or community refer to them instead of in a panic mode, not knowing what to do.
And so what does it achieve when everyone is working together and, everybody, there's that synergy of skills that you're talking about? What are the benefits?
Well, bottom line, the greatest benefit is increased confidence and the fact that we're not afraid of suicide and suicidal thoughts. And we're ready to step into that space and to support each other. Also, to build a culture that is open to really being trained to higher levels. The presence of more people alert and able to know what to do should those thoughts be present. And the people within faith communities and churches spreading out into their communities where they work, live, play, as well as where they worship, to have a greater community-wide impact. All of this is connected to people's calling as people of faith to care for the neighbor and to look out for our community.
And so who can play a role in the network of safety? It's not just the ministers and people directly involved with the church, correct?
Correct. But what we're really wanting to do here in LivingWorks is to engage more people of faith and church leaders. And many others in the community already are trained and are prepared. But we want to knit people together to build a stronger coalition. So that includes pastors, chaplains, ministry leaders, youth group leaders, elders, connecting with those outside or members of their church that represent the functions on the on the right side, crisis lines, health centers, mental health counselors, hospitals, and schools. It is a community working together with the faith community and churches integrated.
Well, thank you, Glenn. That is super helpful. Really gives us a nice overview. We're going to bring in our panelists now. As we mentioned, Dave Troutman is one of our featured guests in the LivingWorks Faith program. As you saw from Dave's video, he didn't feel prepared to support his congregation through that heart-wrenching experience of suicide. We're going to hear from Dave about the network of safety that they've created at Westwood Community Church. We're also going to hear from his colleague, John Diddy. John is the kids ministry pastor at Westwood, and he's also a key part of the network of safety that they've been able to build. So congratulations to them. So Dave, we heard in the video, how nervous you were, how anxious you were. Thank you for being so honest, and so vulnerable. It's really powerful. That was back in 2005. So we have to ask the question, what's happened since then?
Thank you, Michelle. Since that early experience, I've had similar situations where I've been reminded again and again of the importance and listening. So today, when I feel pressured to do or to say something in situations like that, I try to remind myself that listening really is an intensive form of caring. And I've looked for opportunity to bring others along in training as well and in practice around these things. So I've personally taken steps to be better equipped to respond in conversations where a person may be thinking of suicide. And then I've looked for ways to bring others along in training to listen, to ask about what they're seeing and observing, what they're sensing, to be more confident about their ability to really engage someone who may be distressed, even thinking of suicide. So we've hosted Safe Talk and have encouraged our ministry staff and our volunteers to take part in it. Several of our student ministry leaders and our small group leaders have participated. They found it to be really practical and applicable in their relationships, certainly within church, but also outside of church settings, in their work settings, in their families. And so
Safe Talk has been really practical and valuable. We've also encouraged and sponsored several of our volunteers to take the online START program. That has been a great investment, and it's very accessible. And within 60 to 90 minutes, people have been very encouraged to practice these skills and to be just better equipped. Several of our volunteers who do senior adult ministry with us, and during this period of COVID, they have been calling through our seniors to just check on those that might be a bit more at risk. They have found START to be a real asset to them, a way to listen and respond. And then finally, we hosted the 2-day assist training as a way of expanding our network of safety. We invited a couple of members of our own staff to take part in it, as well as members from our partners in the community. And that has really furthered our network of safety.
So having the skills is one thing, putting them into practice is another. A lot of us, there's still a lot of fear. You don't want to say the wrong thing. Can you give us a specific example when you were able to actually put those skills into practice?
Certainly, I think of a young mom with a toddler and a newborn, and she was attending one of our programs for young moms here on campus. And I happened to walk through our church lobby and noticed that there were several moms gathered around this particular young woman, and they all seemed rather distressed and distraught. And so I'll call this young lady Sarah. It seems that Sarah had shared with some in her group that she was really feeling rather overwhelmed with a new baby, responsibilities at home, and just life in general. And she had voiced out loud that she really didn't know how she was going to go on, which naturally raised concerns for those in her group about Sarah's safety, about the safety of her children. And apparently some in the group knew that she had a history of postpartum depression. So naturally, the women were very concerned about her, and they were urging her to go to the emergency room and seek medical help. But she was really resistant to that idea. So they didn't quite know where to go next. And as I walked by, one of the moms in the group saw me, and she asked if I would come by and talk with Sarah, which I did. And it was a great setting to practice asking the question about suicide. Based on what Sarah had shared with the others, I simply said, Sarah, it sounds like you're feeling really overwhelmed. Sometimes when people feel overwhelmed like that, they consider suicide. Are you thinking of suicide? And so, to be honest, I really just borrowed directly from the LivingWorks script, but I'm not sure without practicing that ahead of time that I would have had the confidence to just simply reflect and go there with her. So it was really a wonderful way, to which she responded, no, I'm not thinking about suicide. I am overwhelmed and I just need support, which allowed us then to kind of shift the focus of consideration to what type of support did she currently have? What type of support might she need and be open to? And rather than pushing a need for immediate medical attention, she was willing to make a call to our county crisis team. And we waited together while we made a handoff to a crisis response team member who was able to come to church and meet with her. So it was an unsettling experience for sure, but it also allowed for us to apply the LivingWorks training and reach out to another team member in our network of safety.
What a perfect example of the network of safety, working the way it's supposed to and practicing those skills. Because the programs do have a lot of role playing, which is an excellent feature. And I know, John, we're going to bring John in here. You've also taken the training. How did that feel to do some of that role playing?
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for having me today. Being brought into the training by Dave, it was very stretching, we'll just say it that way. But what I really appreciated is that going into situations before that, I felt so ill-equipped. I remember being on the phone with somebody who was in crisis, and I simply didn't know what to do. So I was sliding notes to my wife. She called up her sister, who's a therapist, and we were working in tandem to try to talk to this person. I just simply had no idea what to say. And so being able to sit through LivingWorks and try to actually verbalize those things that will help to be on both sides of the dynamic of sort of presenting yourself as somebody in crisis, and then also trying to work with somebody and speak to them as though they're in crisis. That was a huge step forward for me in being able to have these difficult conversations with people.
Absolutely. Dave, can I ask, so you're, a leader in your church, and when you brought up this idea of, I think this is really important, we need to start building a network of safety, what was the reaction?
Well, I think it was overall very positive. It certainly trips into some fears that some have, that, if we begin to probe into this, are we encouraging, or where are we going with this? Are we really equipped to support these needs that it might surface? But overall, the response to offering LivingWorks training has been positive. And those who have participated either in person or in the online formats have found it to be very practical, very applicable to their relationships. And I've not received any pushback. Rather, people have appealed to me and to John and to others that we would talk more openly about concerns of mental health, that we would talk about suicide, that we would further the conversation and learn to be better equipped to do so, and even offer additional training. And I would add that some of the greatest interest and encouragement to offering LivingWorks training has come from partner organizations, those that we serve alongside of within our community, our schools, the county, even law enforcement and chaplains in our community have really encouraged, have attended and asked that we continue to offer this type of training. So they've welcomed our initiatives to be better equipped, and then to see ourselves as part of this broader partnership and serving our communities.
So John, you're, with the kids ministry, how much do we have to worry about suicide and mental health issues with our kids and our teens? And maybe it's more the parents you're dealing with?
Yeah, I think, when I sit across from a parent, and I've had this happen, and they come to me and say, my child or my student is thinking about suicide. What do I do? I've looked at those parents and wondered what's the next step. I now feel better equipped to begin that conversation of even helping that parent find the next step. And I also don't think that it's beyond reality that we have really little kids sometimes who are struggling with really difficult thoughts, and we need to help a parent. I have a friend who said to me, my 7-year-old was expressing thoughts of suicide. And, it was just a conversation. He was already getting help for his little girl, but those are real realities. And I think also, as we talked about, Glenn was talking about, suicide has a ripple effect, right? And those that it impacts. 8 years ago, I started at a church. The biggest concern that those students had in that moment was that I would not understand the suicide that they had all walked through as a community. And so really having that pastoral heart and that openness, but also that willingness to then dive into those very difficult conversations. We have to do that, and we have to be willing to take that step.
Absolutely. Dave, in the big picture, how would you say that attitudes regarding suicide have changed now at Westwood?
Well, I think we've stepped into seeing ourselves as a place that does offer hope, and in practical ways knows how to extend that hope and point toward those places where life is encouraged, where meaningful relationships develop, where there are resources for people who are struggling. So I think that one of the attitudes that's changed is just there's a greater openness to acknowledge that we are living with these experiences that are deeply distressing, and we have resource, and we have something to offer people that when they turn to us, we are better equipped. I think that there's this. One of the things that LivingWorks helped me with a lot was to realize these invitations that are extended, invitations to life. Even for myself, early on, I would assume that somebody who might express a suicidal thought or intention that they really did intend to die, that's perhaps where they were wanting to see things go. But in reality, these invitations to living, to life, that can be drawn out and observed and reflected upon, that LivingWorks really helps train us to be aware of and to work with, have been a great shift in my own approach in our work with people.
Well, this is so exciting and why we're thrilled really to be launching LivingWorks Faith. We're going to bring Glenn back in here. We want to learn more about the program, Glenn, how it can help diminish stigma, and of course, start to build a network of safety.
Absolutely. Let me just share just very quickly a little bit of an overview. As I said before, so few clergy, many of the studies have pointed out, lack training. And I think that John and Dave, expressed what that feels like to be in that position and to not know what to say next. Often people of faith in our faith communities and churches come to us with that expectation. But yet when we take a look at the studies, the surveys of clergy, there's very little training. So there's a huge gap. And so LivingWorks Faith is designed to fill that gap. It's not a standalone program that is designed to take the place of a whole seminary course, but it's a specialized component of pastoral counseling, of really that is focused on suicide. So it's 5 to 6 hours. It's all online. It's self-paced. It covers, as I said, prevention, intervention, and postvention. So the prevention, all of the good things that are happening within the church and faith community, but also identifying some unique things. And I'll show more about that in a minute. But what's really cool is it's very interactive. So we have a companion guide with it. We want the learning to be done. We're not telling people what to believe or think about scriptural texts or about theology, but we're asking those good questions to help them to reflect on their own beliefs and how it aids the work of suicide prevention. Powerfully, we use a narrative approach. And as I might have said already, we went through 3 iterations of development. And finally, we landed on interviewing people like Dave and who tell their stories of what it was like before they were trained, after they were trained, and some of the things and issues that they struggled with. So we have about 15 different people, clergy from many, many different communities within Christianity, Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, non-denominational. We have male and female clergy speaking, but we also have survivors. We have a veteran that tells his story. We have parents talking about the loss of their children. We have a therapist. We have a couple that struggled with thoughts as a ministry couple. So that we weave the content around, and it's very, very engaging. And then bottom line, it's designed to reduce anxiety and help the learners to prepare to bring hope by being trained to know what to do when suicide is involved.
And those interviews that you're speaking about are so powerful. Give us a little more insight, if you will, Glenn, into the course content and the different modules.
All right. Well, here are the 8 modules that we have. And I'm pretty excited about number 2 in the sense that really we're talking there about attitudes. We look at biblical narratives that involve suicide. Then we look at church history and how that affects and brought about stigma. And we, in that conversation about attitudes, we really stress how attitudes help or hinder an intervention, help or hinder becoming involved in leadership, and underscoring the fact that suicide prevention is a part of your role. It is part of caring, loving our neighbor and loving one another within the context of faith. So that's the role of faith leaders. The intervene portion uses LivingWorks Start. Very interactive. You use your microphone, you interact with people in that, that particular technology-based intervention training. And then we talk about funerals, memorials, the uniqueness of suicide grief, and long-term care. Then we have a wonderful scenario where the learner goes into a home immediately after a death by suicide and has to interact with people and has to kind of anticipate what's going to happen. That puts all the training into practice. So then we have a wonderful resource page with links and much, much more detail for studying and references. So it's the full package, and we think it will accomplish several learning goals and outcomes.
Tell us
And
about those.
here they are. To really become an advocate and a leader in keeping your own faith community safe and partnering with the larger faith community. To create that culture within your own ministry setting, to be alert to our own attitudes, our own stigma, and then to develop strategies for working together within and without and outside of the walls of the church or faith community to gain greater confidence, of which both John and Dave talked about readiness and then hope that comes from knowing what to do and saving a life. All those are very, very critical pieces and are woven using an approach that builds sequentially. We're not going to ask people to just plunge into that final scenario without giving them the tools and helping them to think about all those components before they get there.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So this is where we want to hear from you. If you're on the call today, just go ahead and drop a question in the chat. You can let us know who it's directed for, whether it's Glenn or Dave or John, and we'll be happy to send it their way. You can also email us if you're not comfortable putting it in the chat. Feel free to reach out by email. faith@livingworks.net is where you can reach us. And we are going to continue this series of webinars. We've actually had quite a lot of interest from people wanting to learn more about LivingWorks Faith. So we're planning another webinar in December. We'd love to see you there. And you can also go to our website, livingworks.net/faith for more info. So in terms of our questions, we've got one here for Dave. What do you have to say to people who might argue that suicide prevention training should be left to professional counselors and psychologists?
Well, I think that that was my approach early on, to assume that there were professionals that were better equipped to respond than myself. And I think that there certainly are skilled and trained professionals that we need to include in this experience. But I think that as we've experienced this to be a form of first aid and building a safety network, I think that I've come to see the value of stepping into and alongside of people at their point of need and building a bridge and then helping them cross that bridge to those that are better equipped to carry on support and care for them long term. So I see it as a partnership. I see that for myself and for our congregation, I've just accepted more of a role and realized both the limits, but also the actual resourcing that we can provide the persons who are thinking of suicide and helping them take next steps to those places that are on a professional basis or more long-term basis able to provide skilled care for them.
And John, how did your training help you with getting over the fear of saying the wrong thing?
Sure. I think the reality is a conversation is just what needs to take place so often. And I understood that it wasn't necessarily that moment that I had to figure out if they had a plan or if they had, what was their next step. But instead, it was just a moment of when I could begin to express to them that there's care here and that there's a desire to hear their story. And there's a desire to know what's brought them to this moment. And I think even piggybacking on what Dave was saying, and that question that you asked him, sometimes it's just that we're the ones that receive the phone call or that we're in the situation. And so the training then enables us to enter into that with a new level, just simply a new level of confidence and I guess tools in the tool belt to begin and to have that conversation. It's not necessarily perfect. It's just who we are, and it's us showing up and us engaging, and that's I guess how it helped me. It helped me know I didn't have to have all the answers, but I could be present with somebody.
I love that, John. Yeah, we all worry so much, right, about being perfect and saying exactly the right thing, but it's just being there and being ready to listen. Glenn, I've got a two-parter here for you. People are asking other versions of LivingWorks Faith will it be developed for other faiths?
Yes, that's really our intention. I'm on this national task force, the National Action Alliance Faith Community Task Force. And I've got some wonderful friends that are Jewish, and they've got a variety of different programs. We would love to connect with some rabbis and some people with lived experience to speak into this. In fact, LivingWorks Faith was reviewed by a friend of mine, Dan Roberts, who's a rabbi. And he said, "Oh, Glenn, this will be so easy for us to shift over to be appropriate for rabbis." I also have some connections with some imams. So however, if we try to put all those together, I think that faith leaders from a variety of different groups would feel that, boy, that's pretty hard to do, because we have scripture, we have theologies, we have traditions that we need to understand. And out of respect for those uniquenesses, we decided to keep this distinctively Christian. And as I mentioned, of course, we're probably not going to get everyone in the broader Christian community either, that certain people will be looking for certain things, but we certainly have tried to have a diversity of clergy and different denominations represented, so that we can all agree, even though we have uniquenesses that are very important to us, that suicide prevention is something that we can agree on and find that middle road of unity to be prepared to help our people. So that's why we did what we did. And I believe that faith leaders would want to have their scripture and have discussions by leaders that recognize that and speak that language.
And so if you already are assist trained, do you recommend that people still take LivingWorks Faith, or are there other, do you need prerequisite LivingWorks courses before you can take Faith?
No, there's no prerequisite. In fact, we've spoken with many who are in the suicide prevention field, and they're just delighted to have something that is the complete package. So we talk about prevention, intervention, and postvention all in one. And for years, there's been questions about how do we engage faith leaders? And if I could just get on the soapbox just for a minute, sometimes there exists a barrier about the secular world, and I'm not comfortable. I don't know anyone there. That's a hard barrier to go over. And then there's a barrier from people who are not people of faith. How can I have a conversation with faith leaders? I'm not. And I think that having LivingWorks Faith makes it a lot easier for both to begin to speak together. Using courses, our other courses, really Start, Safe Talk, and Assist are not faith integrated. However, we have many, many military chaplains who are faith leaders themselves, who are trainers. We're focused there on suicide intervention. So I'm just hoping that this tool will break down some barriers and strengthen coalitions together, because now we have something that speaks the language of clergy and ministry leaders.
And Glenn, what is the cost of LivingWorks Faith?
The cost of LivingWorks Faith is $149.95.
Okay. So here's a question, and I'll let all of you jump in. Maybe we'll start with Dave first. How do we overcome the stigma of suicide and the concept that suicide is a sin? It still exists out there.
I really appreciated what John said, that, we're invited into situations and to meet people where they're at. And so that becomes a point of bringing hope and having the conversation, and allows all of us to reflect on our understanding of suffering and of compassion. So I think it's, coming alongside a family that may be grieving death by suicide. Certainly that's a very complicated form of grief, and leads to many distressing questions. And being present in that conversation is part of our role and responsibility, and really develops and deepens my own theology and understanding of suffering and of hope. So I would add those thoughts, that meeting people where they're at allows for a conversation and invites exploring these things about our understanding of life and death and eternal things.
Glenn, another question here. Have you noticed that when dealing with people in your congregation, they're more likely not to share their feelings because they're afraid of being labeled as a person prone to having suicidal ideations?
That's right. And that's all a part of what we call stigma, now, and the stigma is a perception of being looked at differently from outside ourselves, or a projection of what we might feel ourselves. It's a two-sided kind of experience. And so when a pastor can talk about a ministry leader, a chaplain, someone in a ministry network, a chaplain who's just having a conversation, that sometimes there is a pileup of so much pain, so much loss, that one of the founders of the suicide movement, suicidology movement, the study of suicide, Edwin Schneidman, talked about constriction, where people, they think about that so much that they just have a hard time seeing, the things that keep them alive. Well, I believe it's the same things with suicide. If someone believes that about themselves, that's what they're going to see, and that's what they're going to look at for others. So having conversations that suicide is a part of being human, and as Dave said, a part of the human condition of suffering. And so we must be ready to talk about that suffering and also to talk about the things that keep people alive. And but first we've got to listen to the part about suffering, the part about death first, before we move to those things that keep a person alive. It's a very nuanced conversation and something we talk about in LivingWorks Assist. But once you understand that and are patient, what I think with some of these questions, whether it's stigma or whether it's the sin question, is, well, why do we want to know that? And is this the right time to talk about that? Right now, we want to talk about keeping you safe, helping you through this very difficult time, and being present with you, and really stressing God's grace, God's mercy, God's deep understanding of our human condition. That was a very long question or answer to your question.
It's a big question.
Yes,
This is for John. How big is Westwood Church, and was it difficult to start building the network of safety? Dave or John, perhaps.
Well, I'll let Dave talk about building the network, and our numbers. He can correct me if I'm wrong, but well, we have about 3,000 who attend pre-COVID, I should say, on an average weekend. We have around 1,800 members. But as Dave is the one who, I guess, started the network, he can jump in there.
Okay.
Well, I think that starting the network, you know, we have built bridges in our community with community leaders. So we see ourselves and we relate within our community as part of the broader community to be a place of hope and encouragement and resourcing and partnering with. So it's frankly, it's been, I think, the keeping ongoing communication with school leaders, for instance, you know, that we've had a good rapport through our student ministries who are present on campuses, interacting with school leaders. So that's been one avenue. I am in touch with the chaplains that serve with police and fire departments. So I have an avenue of connection there. And then we've reached out to community and county leaders. So we understand what's happening through social services and other types of crisis response teams. So we've just drawn on those relationships that we've developed over the years and tried to be more intentional to talk about the needs and the resources that we can share together.
And Glenn, what's the response been like from the larger faith community to LivingWorks Faith?
it's only been out for 2 weeks. So, but there's a lot, the people that have seen it and given feedback, we've talked to some state leaders, we've talked to some other leaders in the suicide prevention community. It's very positive. And what they really talk about is the authenticity of those who share their stories and the, I guess, the structure and the flow of the material. We've really gotten some great accolades, and it's much due to the people who are willing to be transparent, like Dave, to sit in front of a camera and talk about those stories, and many others like Dave. And then our developers weaving the content around there. And I think that's what's really been very a positive aspect, and why we're getting great feedback. But we'll see. You know, this is kind of an interesting time to launch a course, but we've got a few initiatives that we're going to be trying, and I imagine we will gain some momentum. So all those of you on this webinar, just get the word out and let us know. We're open to hearing your feedback.
All right, I want to be respectful of our time and our panelists' time. We're closing in on the end here. It's been an amazing discussion. Glenn, any final thoughts before we start to wrap things up?
Yes, I would just love to finish this up with a call to action. One is, um, like Dave and John and others, to lead or to promote leadership in this area. I know that we stand in parallel to mental health conversations within faith communities, but we need leaders who will be a catalyst for change by asking the question, what can we do differently? How does my faith, what does my faith community need? And how can my leadership support this? I don't think that leaders need to lead it all, but sometimes they promote leadership by engaging survivors, those with lived experience, to speak out of their own life experience. Also to leaders to get the training themselves. And LivingWorks Faith is a great place to start. And as John and Dave talked about, we really started with one Safe Talk, and then we did another Safe Talk, and from that we moved into Assist. So get the training, support the training for your volunteers and your subordinate ministry leaders. And subordinates talk to your leaders about getting the training. You know, it goes up, it goes, you know, when you think hierarchically, I'm talking like a chaplain. Then finally, build a network of safety. You know, train people appropriately. Not everyone needs the deepest levels of intervention training, but many, many more people need to be connectors. And so START is a great tool. How can I empower my people to take care of their neighbors, their friends in the youth group, and people in our own congregation? So lead, be a catalyst, get the training, and build a network for safety. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so wonderful to have our panelists here today and really get a feel for how things are working at your church, and you know that others, you serve as a model really, I think, for other faith leaders and communities to emulate. So thank you so much to both John and Dave. It is important to remember that we all have a role to play in suicide prevention, and as faith leaders you can make a tremendous difference. So let's start now. If you have follow-up questions that we didn't discuss today, please feel free to reach out to us, faith@livingworks.net. You can also check out our website, livingworks.net/faith. Once again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy day for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.